The cold morning wrapped Arlington National Cemetery in a heavy mist, the white marble headstones stretching out like a frozen army. Flags fluttered weakly on distant poles, but the real sound, the one no one could escape, was the broken howl of a war dog. Ranger, the German shepherd, sat rigid beside Sergeant First Class Thomas Eno, his body trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper, something primal. Thomas tightened his hand around Ranger's collar, feeling the raw strength straining underneath, trying to tear toward the flag-draped coffin in front of them. The bugler's notes faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the restless wind seemed to freeze as Ranger let out a second, longer howl that made the very ground feel hollow beneath their feet. Mourners shifted uncomfortably, side eyes flickering at each other. Death was supposed to be dignified, controlled. But Ranger was screaming into the void, telling them all something was wrong. Thomas could barely breathe. His chest felt like it was caving in. The man in that coffin wasn't just another fallen comrade, he was Captain David Carson, the brother in arms who had dragged him out of firestorms and suicide missions, who had once grabbed him by the flak vest and growled, "You die when I say so." And today's not that day. Thomas whispered under his breath, "Easy, boy." Easy, but his own voice was shaking. Then the coffin shook. It was small at first. A whisper of movement, a vibration. Then louder, 3 soft, deliberate thuds. The honor guard stiffened, eyes wide. A woman gasped and dropped her bouquet of roses. Thomas staggered back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He recognized that sound. He had heard it in collapsed bunkers, in body bags zipped too soon. But never in the middle of a polished American funeral. A dragging noise followed. Then a faint tap, like nails scratching wood. Thomas's hand shot up instinctively. "Open it." He barked at the stunned funeral director. Chaos erupted. Soldiers dropped rifles. Mourners stumbled over folding chairs. The bugler dropped his trumpet. Ranger lunged forward, paws scratching at the earth, desperate to get to the coffin. 2 Marines scrambled to unseal the casket, their faces ghost white. As the heavy lid creaked upward, a bruised, bloodied hand forced its way into the light. The world held its breath. Captain David Carson's face appeared, pale as death, eyes wild, mouth gasping for air. A scream tore from the crowd. Someone fainted. Ranger barked, deep and thunderous, as if he could bark life back into his fallen comrade. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the coffin, his hand trembling as he reached out. "David," his voice cracked like a breaking bone. David coughed violently, his whole body seizing. "Don't. Close it," he rasped, barely audible. Medics sprinted from the sidelines, forcing their way through the panicked crowd. Oxygen masks, 4 bags, frantic orders, but Thomas didn't move. He stayed kneeling there, clutching Ranger's collar with one hand and gripping David's dirt-streaked fingers with the other, tethering them both to the world of the living. Only then did Thomas notice the mark, a small, neat puncture wound on David's neck. A puncture that didn't belong. He felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. This wasn't just a miracle. This was a message. Someone had buried Captain David Carson alive. And Thomas Eno knew, deep in his gut, that the war he thought he had left behind was only just beginning. The ambulance's siren shattered the heavy silence as it sped away from Arlington, leaving behind stunned mourners and whispers that would ripple through the nation for days. But Thomas Eno wasn't listening. He sat rigidly in the back of the emergency vehicle, one hand gripping the stretcher where David Carson lay gasping under an oxygen mask, the other resting protectively on Ranger's tense shoulders. Thomas couldn't stop staring at that wound, the tiny puncture at the side of David's neck. Clean. Precise. It wasn't battlefield shrapnel. It wasn't trauma from the blast they had been told killed him. It was something far more sinister, The medic kept darting glances at Thomas, clearly shaken. Finally, she whispered, "Sir, I've seen combat injuries. I've seen death. That." She gestured vaguely toward David's neck. "That's not normal." Thomas just nodded grimly. He already knew at the hospital. Sterile lights flickered overhead as they rushed David into a secure room. Doctors barked orders. Nurses scrambled. Thomas remained rooted outside the door, fists clenched. Ranger pressed against his leg like a living shadow. Hours dragged by. Every beep of the monitor felt like a countdown. He didn't understand. When the attending physician finally emerged, face drawn and pale, Thomas straightened. "He's alive," she said, almost in disbelief. "Barely. Severe hypoxia. Cardiac activity so faint, it registered as flatline. If your dog hadn't reacted." Her voice faltered. "We would have buried him alive." Thomas swallowed the rising bile in his throat. "How long will he be unconscious?" "Hard to say," the doctor admitted. "A day, maybe 2. If he survives the night." If Thomas sat at David's bedside, staring at the man who had once been larger than life, now reduced to tubes and bandages. He remembered Kandahar, the smell of burning tires, the taste of dust thick in the air, and David's iron grip pulling him out of the wreckage. "You die when I say so, soldier." The words haunted him now. Ranger whined softly, pawing at the side of the bed. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his head. "He's here, buddy," he whispered. "You found him. You saved him." Double quotes. As night fell, the hospital grew eerily quiet. Too quiet. Thomas's instincts prickled, honed from years of ambushes and bad intel. He left David's room briefly to speak with security. They checked the hallway cameras around the funeral service. And that's when the dread truly set in. The footage was corrupted. Static filled the exact minutes surrounding the coffin incident. No clear shots. No explanations, almost as if someone had deliberately wiped it. When Thomas returned to the room, he wasn't alone. A man stood at the far end of the hallway, a dark suit, expressionless face. Government issue. His presence was wrong, out of place. When their eyes met, the man turned and disappeared into the stairwell. Thomas broke into a run, Ranger hot on his heels. But when he reached the stairwell, it was empty. Only the faint smell of cheap cologne and burnt coffee lingered in the air. Back in David's room, the tension tightened like a noose. Thomas locked the door, pulled the blinds, checked the vents. Whoever was watching wasn't just curious. They were waiting for David to die again, for real this time. Hours later, David stirred. Weak, barely conscious. His eyes fluttered open, locking onto Thomas. "They think I know," he rasped, voice dry as sandpaper. "They think I saw something." Thomas leaned closer. "What, David? What did you see?" David's hand gripped Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words burned into Thomas's brain like a brand. Buried files. The strike. Not insurgents. Civilians. Secret ops. Cover up. Then David's body seized, alarms blaring as the monitors went wild. Nurses burst into the room. Thomas was pushed aside as they fought to stabilize him. Standing outside the chaos, Ranger pressing close to his leg again, Thomas Eno made a silent vow. He was going to find out what David had seen, and this time, nobody was going to bury the truth. The wind howled outside the hospital windows like a living thing, battering the glass with invisible fists. Thomas Eno sat rigid beside David's bed. Ranger sprawled protectively across the threshold like a sentry carved from flesh and bone. The world outside ticked on obliviously, but inside this small, sterile room, time felt frozen, caught in the fragile breaths of a man who should have been buried and forgotten. Thomas leaned in closer to David's weak form, desperate for answers before someone tried again to silence him for good. "Tell me everything," Thomas whispered, his voice roughened by exhaustion and fear. David's eyes, still glassy from the trauma, darted around the room. His cracked lips parted. They buried more than soldiers in that desert. He rasped, his fingers, trembling, gripped Thomas's sleeve. "In Helmand. There was a village," he gasped. "They said it was hostile. But it wasn't. Families, kids, all wiped out. No enemy weapons. No insurgents. Just people." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face and the files. He urged. David swallowed hard, wincing. "Intel reports. Video feeds. Drone footage. All falsified. They planted evidence afterward to justify the strike." Thomas sat back, the weight of it crashing down. They hadn't just been sent to fight a war. They had been sent to silence witnesses. He clenched his fists, trying to contain the rage clawing up his throat before he could speak again. The lights in the room flickered once, twice, then held steady. Coincidence? Or a warning? His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Another text flashed on the screen. "You're being watched. Walk away." Thomas's grip tightened around the phone until he thought it might shatter across the room. Ranger growled low, his hackles rising, his eyes fixed on the small vent near the ceiling. Thomas followed his gaze, heart pounding. Hidden cameras? Listening devices? No, something worse. Thomas remembered what Carla Henson had said off-book teams. Black operations. Cleaning up messes no one could ever prove existed. And now they were the mess. Thomas acted fast. He disconnected every machine except for David's oxygen supply, wrapped him tightly in a blanket, and motioned to Ranger. Time to move. Boy.it wasn't just survival now. It was war again. He moved quickly through the hospital corridors, keeping his head low, every step rehearsed, instinct from years of evading enemy patrols. When they reached the back loading dock, Thomas spotted the van, a plain, unmarked hospital transport vehicle he had arranged hours earlier under false credentials. He opened the doors, gently placed David inside, and climbed behind the wheel. Ranger jumped in after them, his body a tense coil of readiness. They pulled away from the hospital just as the first unmarked black SUV rounded the corner into the parking lot. Thomas didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The drive was a blur of adrenaline and half-formed plans. He took side streets, back roads, anything that would throw off a tail. David drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling half-formed words, buried alive. "To bury the truth," he whispered once, his voice hollow. Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. They didn't just want David dead. They wanted what he knew erased from history. Forever, hours later, they reached the safe house, a decrepit hunting cabin deep in the Pennsylvania woods. .NOE-FI. No cell towers. No easy way in or out. It wasn't a fortress, but it would have to do. Thomas carried David inside, laying him on the threadbare couch, and began fortifying the place as best he could. Ranger patrolled every corner, sniffing, searching, guarding. As the night fell around them, Thomas sat at the dusty table, map spread before him. There was only one move left: find someone who could expose the truth, someone who couldn't be silenced. David stirred behind him, muttering a name through cracked lips. Anna Velasquez. Thomas's eyes narrowed. He knew that name. A journalist. Relentless. Fearless. The kind of woman who had made powerful enemies, chasing the truth about America's darkest secrets if anyone could help them. It was her, but reaching her would be like painting a target on their backs. Thomas looked at Ranger. curled protectively beside David's battered body, and he made a decision. They wouldn't run anymore. They would fight. For the truth, for David, for Ranger, for every life buried under lies and silence, tomorrow the real war would begin, and this time he wasn't following orders. He was writing his own. The first light of dawn bled across the treetops like a warning, casting long, jagged shadows through the woods surrounding the cabin. Thomas stood on the front porch, shotgun resting against the railing, eyes locked on the winding dirt road below. Somewhere, out there in the mist, he knew they were coming inside. David lay pale but conscious, the color slowly returning to his face. Ranger dozed lightly by his side, one ear flicking with every distant noise. Thomas had sent the encrypted files through the only secure line he trusted, praying Ana Velasquez would act quickly. There was no going back now. The truth was out, but survival. That was still a battle they hadn't won yet. He heard it before he saw it, the low rumble of engines slicing through the morning stillness. Not one vehicle, not two, three black SUVs, moving in silent formation, tires crunching over the frost-bitten dirt. They had found them. Thomas turned back to the cabin and quietly bolted the door. He moved swiftly, barricading windows, reinforcing the doorframe. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was buying time, time for the files to spread, time for David to live, time to honor Ranger's sacrifices past, present, and yet to come. The first SUV stopped 100 yards from the cabin. Doors opened. Black-clad figures emerged, faces covered, weapons drawn, their movements as precise as a drill team. Ranger stood now, low growl vibrating in his chest. Thomas knelt beside him, ruffling the dog's fur. "This is it, boy," he whispered. "One more mission." He turned to David, whose trembling hands clutched a pistol with more determination than strength. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly. David's voice was hoarse but steady. "They buried me once, Tom. I won't let them do it again." Thomas nodded once. That was all he needed. The first shot cracked the silence. A window exploded inward, shards of glass raining across the floor. Thomas returned fire instantly, methodically, one round, one breath. Ranger charged toward the broken window, barking like a war drum, teeth flashing. The cabin became a battlefield, smoke and gunfire weaving through the wooden walls, the echoes of war reborn in the soil of American ground. Thomas moved with brutal efficiency, drawing on every lesson carved into him through blood and loss. David provided cover from behind the kitchen counter, his hands shaking but his aim true. It wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to hold. For now, outside, the attackers regrouped. They were professionals, cleaners, sent to erase not just a mistake, but every trace of it. Thomas knew he couldn't hold them forever, and that was fine, because he didn't need forever, only a little longer. In a rare moment of calm between gunshots, a strange sound pierced the chaos, a distant wail. Sirens, police, locals, maybe even media drawn by the emergency beacons Thomas had set up when they first arrived. Help was coming. The men outside realized it too. The gunfire slowed, then stopped. Thomas peered through the shattered window and saw the black-clad operatives retreating, fading into the woods like phantoms. But it wasn't over. One remained, a tall figure, no mask this time, just cold, merciless eyes fixed on the cabin. He strode forward, gun lowered. Thomas stepped onto the porch, shotgun hanging loosely by his side, Ranger beside him. The man stopped a few yards away. "You think you've won?" he said, voice like gravel. "You just made yourselves targets forever." Thomas smiled grimly. "We were targets the moment we chose to tell the truth." The man's lip curled in disdain. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Ranger lunged. With the last reserves of his strength, the dog hurled himself forward, knocking the man off balance. Thomas didn't hesitate. One clean shot rang out, and the threat fell limp into the dust. Ranger limped back, blood trailing from a new wound. Thomas caught him before he collapsed, cradling the dog's battered body against his chest. "You did it, boy," Thomas whispered, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. "You brought us home." The flashing lights crested the hill. Officers rushed forward, weapons drawn but hesitating at the sight of the scene, the destroyed vehicles, the masked attackers, the broken soldier cradling his war dog in his arms. David stumbled out of the cabin, one arm raised in surrender, the other clutching the duffel bag filled with proof of a conspiracy too large to ignore. The world spun faster after that. News, cameras, investigations. A national reckoning fueled by David's testimony and the undeniable evidence. He and Thomas had risked everything to deliver. Heads rolled, offices emptied, secrets spilled like blood across the evening news. Through it all, Thomas stayed silent, watching from the sidelines. He didn't need recognition. He had already found what he was looking for. 1 year later, on a bright spring morning, Thomas knelt under a broad oak tree behind a new shelter. He had built Ranger's Refuge, a haven for wounded veterans and abandoned service dogs. Its heart stood a simple stone marker. Ranger, warrior, guardian, brother. He saved more than lives. He saved the truth. Thomas laid a hand on the stone, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back and the weightlessness of a promise kept. He had fought his last battle, and for once he had won.